August 1758. The strongest fortress in North America sits under siege. Louisbourg, massive stone walls, hundreds of cannons, thousands of French defenders. Commanding the British fleet that's about to shatter French power across an entire continent is Admiral Edward Boscawen. 50 years before Nelson sailed into immortality, this man crushed 3 empires. He destroyed the French Mediterranean fleet at Lagos, captured France's American stronghold at Louisbourg, prevented a French invasion of Britain, and established British naval supremacy that would last a century. He pioneered the aggressive close-quarters tactics Nelson would make famous. He revolutionized amphibious warfare. His sailors called him Old Dreadnought because nothing could shake his nerve in battle. Yet ask anyone today about great British admirals, and they'll name Nelson, perhaps Drake or Hawke. Boscawen's name draws blank stares despite the fact he shaped the British Empire more profoundly than almost any other naval commander in history. This is the story of the admiral who won the world for Britain, then somehow slipped from popular memory entirely. If you want to discover the man whose victories made Nelson's later triumphs possible, hit that like button and subscribe. Edward Boscawen was born on the 19th of August, 1711, at Tregothnan in Cornwall, an estate belonging to his family, the Viscounts Falmouth. The title sounds impressive until you understand how Georgian England actually worked. Yes, the Boscawens held a viscountcy, but they weren't swimming in wealth like the great ducal families. More critically, Edward was a younger son, which in the rigid hierarchy of primogeniture meant his prospects were limited from birth. The estate, the title, the inheritance, all that went to his older brother Hugh. Edward received an education, some family connections, and the understanding that he'd need to make his own way in the world. The options for younger sons of the gentry were narrowly defined. The church if you were bookish, the army if you fancied land warfare, or the Royal Navy if you could stomach years at sea with genuinely questionable survival odds. Edward chose the Navy. At 15 years old in 1726, he entered service the way most officers did, through family connections that secured him a position as a midshipman aboard a warship. But getting into the Navy and succeeding in it were entirely different propositions. His early years were education by ordeal. From 1727 to 1728, he served under Admiral Wager in the Caribbean, which meant learning seamanship not from textbooks, but from hurricanes that could snap masts like kindling, tropical diseases that killed more sailors than enemy action ever managed, and the occasional skirmish with Spanish vessels when diplomatic relations permitted violence. Caribbean service was a furnace that either forged capable officers or killed them. Boscawen survived and absorbed the lessons. By the time the War of Jenkins' Ear erupted in 1739, a conflict with Spain that supposedly began over a severed ear but actually stemmed from commercial rivalry and territorial disputes, Boscawen had risen through the ranks steadily. Unlike many officers who'd purchased their positions through family wealth and political connections, Boscawen earned his promotions through demonstrated ability. His crews noticed something unusual. Their captain actually cared whether they lived or died. This wasn't humanitarian enlightenment. Boscawen was a man of his era. But he understood something many aristocratic officers missed. Healthy, well-fed sailors fought better than sick, starving ones. In 1742, he married Frances Glanville. The marriage was genuinely happy by contemporary accounts. 5 children would follow over the years. Letters between Edward and Frances reveal a devoted husband and tender father, a man who could compartmentalize his professional and domestic lives with remarkable clarity. The same officer who would order ships into point-blank cannon range wrote home with affection about his children's progress. His nickname, Old Dreadnought, emerged during these years, though the exact origin remains debated among historians. Some contemporary accounts claimed it came from his absolute fearlessness under fire. Others suggested it referenced his methodical, unstoppable approach to combat, like the heavily armored warships called Dreadnoughts that could absorb tremendous punishment and continue fighting. Whatever the source, the name captured something essential about Boscawen's character. By 1740, approaching 30 years old, Edward Boscawen had transformed from a younger son with limited prospects into a respected naval officer with growing reputation. He'd proven himself in Caribbean and European waters. His crews trusted him. Senior admirals recognized him as someone who delivered results. The War of Austrian Succession was approaching, and with it, Boscawen's chance to prove he was more than just another competent captain. The War of Austrian Succession began in 1740 over European dynastic politics, specifically whether Maria Theresa could inherit the Habsburg territories. But for British naval officers, the continental squabbles mattered far less than the simple reality that France had taken the opposing side. French alliance with Austria's enemies meant French shipping became legitimate prey. French colonies became targets, and French warships became opponents. For the Royal Navy, this was opportunity dressed up as geopolitical necessity. Boscawen spent the early 1740s commanding various ships and small squadrons, gaining experience in fleet operations and learning how senior admirals managed large-scale naval warfare. By 1747, he'd been promoted to command a squadron within Admiral George Anson's fleet, operating in Atlantic waters where French convoys attempting to reach home ports made tempting targets. On the 3rd of May that year, Anson's fleet encountered a large French convoy off Cape Finisterre, the rocky northwestern corner of Spain, where Atlantic swells crashed against Spanish cliffs. Boscawen commanded Anson's vanguard, the forward squadron designed to engage enemy escorts whilst the main fleet maneuvered. Traditional naval doctrine of the period emphasized maintaining formation, fighting in disciplined lines where each ship supported its neighbors, and minimizing risk to valuable warships that cost fortunes to build and years to replace. Admirals who lost ships unnecessarily faced courts-martial and ruined careers. This created cautious mindsets. Better to let an enemy escape than to risk losing your own vessels in pursuit. Boscawen had different ideas. When the French escorts tried scattering to draw pursuers away from the merchant ships they were protecting, he broke formation and gave chase, closing to ranges where British gunnery training and heavier broadsides could devastate French warships. The decision was calculated aggression, not recklessness. Boscawen understood that the strategic objective wasn't preserving his ships in pristine condition. It was destroying French naval power and capturing their wealth. His squadron closed to what sailors called pistol shot range and pounded the French escorts until they struck their colors. Multiple French warships surrendered. The treasure convoy they'd been protecting was captured nearly intact. Parliament and the Admiralty noticed. Boscawen received promotion to Rear Admiral at 36 years old, remarkably young for such rank in an era when seniority often mattered more than achievement. 5 months later, in October 1747, the Admiralty gave Boscawen independent command of a squadron with orders to intercept another French fleet reportedly approaching the Spanish coast. This was different from serving under Anson. No superior officer would be present to approve or countermand decisions. Success or failure would rest entirely on Boscawen's judgment. On the 14th of October, his squadron found the French off Cape Finisterre, 6 French warships escorting a valuable merchant convoy. Boscawen ordered immediate attack. His ships closed rapidly, and the resulting engagement was brutal even by 18th century standards. Wooden warships fighting at close range meant cannonballs smashing through oak planking 2 feet thick, splinters as deadly as the iron shot itself, masts collapsing when rigging was cut, decks slippery with blood as gun crews worked their cannons in conditions that would have seemed like hell to anyone who hadn't experienced naval combat. The French fought hard, but British gunnery training emphasized rapid, accurate fire, and Boscawen's aggressive tactics prevented the French from using their superior maneuverability. Within hours, all 6 French warships had surrendered. The merchant convoy was captured. 2 battles in 6 months, 12 French warships captured, 2 major convoys seized. The strategic impact was enormous. French Atlantic naval capability was crippled just as the war entered its final phase. Boscawen was promoted to Vice Admiral and received formal thanks from Parliament. More importantly, he'd established a tactical philosophy that would define his entire career. Close with the enemy quickly, fight at decisive range where British advantages in gunnery and crew training mattered most, and pursue relentlessly until the enemy was destroyed or captured. The War of Austrian Succession ended in 1748 with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. For Boscawen, peacetime meant reduced opportunities, but his reputation was secure. The Admiralty knew exactly who to assign when they needed decisive action. That assignment came sooner than anyone expected, and it would take Boscawen to the opposite side of the world. In 1748, whilst the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was being negotiated in Europe, the Admiralty was already looking eastward toward the escalating conflict in India. The British East India Company and its French equivalent had been engaged in increasingly aggressive commercial rivalry for decades. What had begun as competition for trade monopolies was rapidly transforming into outright military confrontation, with both companies maintaining private armies and fortified trading posts that functioned as military bases. The Admiralty recognized that whoever controlled Indian Ocean sea lanes would ultimately dominate the subcontinent's lucrative trade. They needed a squadron commander who could project British naval power 8,000 miles from home waters. They chose Boscawen. He arrived in the East Indies in 1748, commanding a squadron tasked with protecting British commercial interests and intimidating French naval forces operating in the region. The strategic situation was complex. The French held Pondicherry, a heavily fortified port on India's southeastern coast that served as their primary stronghold. From Pondicherry, French ships could threaten British trade routes, supply French military forces, fighting alongside Indian allies, and project power across the Bay of Bengal. Boscawen coordinated with East India Company forces to mount a siege beginning in August 1748. The challenge was fundamentally different from anything he'd faced in Atlantic or Mediterranean warfare. Shore batteries mounted on stone fortifications could devastate wooden warships that ventured too close. Ships rolling in ocean swells couldn't aim cannon with the precision of land-based artillery. Boscawen ordered his ships to close to extreme range and conduct sustained bombardment of Pondicherry's seaward defences, accepting damage to his vessels to suppress French batteries and support the land assault. The innovation wasn't simply getting close. Any reckless captain could do that and lose his ship. Boscawen developed systematic bombardment tactics, rotating ships through the firing line so damaged vessels could withdraw for repairs whilst fresh ships maintained pressure. He coordinated naval gunfire with land forces' assault timing, concentrating fire on specific defensive sections before infantry attacks. The siege ultimately failed to capture Pondicherry. The monsoon season arrived, making continued operations impossible, and the peace treaty being finalized in Europe required cessation of hostilities. But the tactical lessons Boscawen learned would prove invaluable a decade later. The East Indies deployment also revealed Boscawen's serious attention to crew welfare. Scurvy was the great killer of long-voyage sailors, a vitamin C deficiency disease that rotted gums, loosened teeth, reopened old wounds, and eventually killed through internal bleeding or infection. Ships on extended deployments could lose half their crews to scurvy. Boscawen implemented dietary improvements based on emerging medical theories, ensuring his ships carried citrus fruits when available. This predated James Linn's official 1753 publication proving citrus prevented scurvy, though the knowledge was circulating among observant naval officers. Despite these precautions, tropical disease still ravaged his squadron. Yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery killed sailors by the dozens. Boscawen himself contracted severe fever that nearly killed him and left him weakened for months. Officers who survived tours in Indian waters were considered hardened veterans. Boscawen returned to England in 1750, his health damaged, but his strategic understanding enhanced. He'd established British naval presence in the Indian Ocean, demonstrated that French positions could be challenged despite their fortifications, and gained invaluable experience in operations far from home support. More importantly, he'd recognized India's strategic importance to global power competition. The 7 Years' War was approaching, and it would be fought from Canada to India. Boscawen's experiences had prepared him perfectly for the global conflict that would reshape 3 empires. War between Britain and France began in 1754, without anyone officially declaring it, which was typical of 18th-century geopolitics, where undeclared conflicts could escalate for years before governments formally acknowledged hostilities. The spark came from North America, where British and French colonial claims overlapped in the Ohio River Valley. Skirmishes between colonial militias and French forces escalated into serious fighting, though in Europe, both governments maintained the diplomatic fiction that peace still existed. This ambiguous situation created opportunities for aggressive commanders willing to act decisively without waiting for politicians to catch up with military realities. The Admiralty recognized that French reinforcements reaching Canada would strengthen their position in North America significantly. In spring 1755, they gave Boscawen command of a squadron with orders to intercept French naval forces attempting to reinforce Quebec. The orders were deliberately ambiguous. Officially, Britain and France weren't at war, so attacking French warships constituted piracy under international law. Unofficially, the government wanted those reinforcements stopped and was willing to create diplomatic incidents to achieve strategic objectives. Boscawen understood perfectly what was being asked of him. In June 1755, Boscawen's squadron was cruising off Newfoundland's Grand Banks when lookouts spotted sails on the horizon. The ships proved to be French warships escorting transports carrying troops and supplies to Canada. Boscawen faced a decision that would have paralyzed more cautious officers. Britain and France were technically at peace. Attacking would create a massive diplomatic crisis, possibly trigger formal war, and potentially ruin his career if the government decided to disavow his actions. But allowing French reinforcements to reach Canada would strengthen French military position enormously. Boscawen ordered attack. On the 8th of June, his ships closed with the French squadron and opened fire. The French were caught completely by surprise. They hadn't expected British warships to attack during peacetime and initially tried signaling that some mistake had occurred. When British cannon continued firing, the French had no choice but to fight back. The engagement was sharp and decisive. 2 French ships, the Alcide and Lise, were captured after brief resistance. The remainder of the French squadron escaped, making for French ports with news of British aggression. The diplomatic explosion was immediate and predictable. French ambassadors in London lodged furious protests. Boscawen had committed what amounted to piracy, attacking warships of a nation with which Britain was supposedly at peace. French newspapers condemned British perfidy. Some voices in British Parliament echoed these criticisms, arguing that Boscawen had dishonored Britain's reputation. The captured French officers themselves were outraged. Boscawen's defense was strategically sound, even if diplomatically questionable. The French weren't sending troops to Canada for peaceful purposes. Those reinforcements would have been used to attack British colonial positions. Waiting for formal war declaration would have given France decisive military advantage. Sometimes preventing enemy build-ups required striking first. His supporters in government, particularly William Pitt the Elder, who would soon become de facto war leader, endorsed his actions completely. The immediate strategic result vindicated Boscawen's decision. French reinforcements to Canada were significantly delayed. The troops and supplies aboard Alcide and Lise never reached Quebec. The psychological impact on French planning was substantial. They now knew British squadrons were actively hunting their convoys even during nominal peacetime. The captured ships themselves were added to the Royal Navy after prize courts ruled them legitimate captures. The broader consequence was accelerating the drift toward formal war. The Newfoundland action made pretending peace existed increasingly absurd. Diplomatic relations deteriorated rapidly through 1755 and 1756. In May 1756, Britain formally declared war on France, officially beginning what would become the 7 Years' War. Though in North America, fighting had been ongoing for 2 years already. Boscawen's reward was promotion to full admiral and assignment to what would become his most challenging theatre yet. North America still needed to be secured, and the key to French power there was a fortress that had already been captured once, then handed back in a previous peace treaty. Louisbourg would have to fall again. By 1758, the 7 Years' War had spread across multiple continents, and Britain's strategy required coordinated operations in several theatres simultaneously. Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder orchestrated an ambitious plan. Whilst Frederick the Great of Prussia tied down French armies in Europe, British forces would strike at French colonial possessions. The centerpiece of the North American strategy was capturing Louisbourg, the massive French fortress on Cape Breton Island that guarded the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. Control Louisbourg, and you controlled access to Quebec. Control Quebec, and French Canada would collapse. Louisbourg had been captured once before in 1745 by New England colonial forces supported by Royal Navy ships, only to be handed back to France in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle as a diplomatic bargaining chip. That decision had enraged American colonists who'd lost men taking the fortress. By 1758, the fortress was stronger than ever. Thick stone walls designed to absorb artillery bombardment, over 200 cannon mounted in batteries covering all approaches, a garrison of roughly 6,000 French regulars and Canadian militia, and a squadron of French warships sheltering in the harbour. The British assembled overwhelming force. General Geoffrey Amherst commanded 14,000 regular troops and colonial forces. Admiral Boscawen commanded the naval component, 15 ships of the line, numerous frigates, and over 100 transport vessels carrying the army, supplies, and siege artillery. This was amphibious warfare on a scale rarely attempted. Boscawen's ships had to transport the entire army across the Atlantic, land them on a hostile shore covered by French artillery, maintain supply lines whilst the siege progressed, blockade the harbour to prevent French reinforcement or escape, and provide naval gunfire support for land operations. Boscawen and Amherst worked remarkably well together, perhaps because both were professionals more interested in results than glory. They planned the operation meticulously during the Atlantic crossing. The landing would be the most dangerous phase. Troops in small boats approaching beaches covered by French cannon and musket fire, completely vulnerable until they reached shore. Boscawen's solution was systematic naval bombardment. His ships would close to extreme range and pound French beach defences immediately before the landing. On the 8th of June 1758, the landing began. Boscawen's ships moved into position and opened fire on French positions defending Kennington Cove. The bombardment was intense, hundreds of cannon firing simultaneously, shells exploding along the beach, solid shots smashing French field fortifications. Under cover of this fire, thousands of British troops climbed into boats and rowed toward shore. French defenders fought back desperately, but the naval bombardment forced them to keep their heads down. The landing succeeded with casualties far lighter than anticipated. Once ashore, Amherst's troops began the slow, methodical process of siege warfare. They dug approach trenches, established artillery batteries, and gradually moved heavy siege guns into position. Boscawen's role became critical again. French warships in the harbour could sortie and bombard British siege positions. Boscawen established a tight blockade, positioning his ships to intercept any French attempt to escape. His squadron essentially became a floating wall, sealing Louisbourg off from the outside world. The siege dragged through June and July. British artillery pounded the fortress walls, whilst French guns replied. Casualties mounted on both sides. Disease threatened besieging troops living in wet trenches. But Boscawen maintained the blockade perfectly, and gradually, British superiority in artillery and resources ground down French resistance. On the 26th of July, after 7 weeks of siege, the French commander surrendered. 5 French warships in the harbour became prizes. 6,000 French troops became prisoners. The strategic consequences were immediate and enormous. With Louisbourg in British hands, the Royal Navy controlled access to French Canada. The following year, British forces would sail up the St. Lawrence to Quebec, which would fall in September. Montreal would surrender in 1760. French power in North America would effectively end. Boscawen's contribution was fundamental. He'd pioneered systematic amphibious operations that would serve Britain for the next century. But whilst Louisbourg was being reduced, Events in European waters were building toward a confrontation that would showcase his tactical brilliance in pure naval combat. Lagos was waiting. The year 1759 would become known in Britain as the Year of Victories, a remarkable 12 months when British arms triumphed across multiple theatres simultaneously. But those victories weren't accidental. They resulted from coordinated strategy, and preventing French countermoves was essential to success. France's response to mounting defeats was desperate but logical: invade Britain itself. If a French army could land on British soil, all colonial victories would become irrelevant. The invasion plan required combining France's Mediterranean fleet based at Toulon with the Atlantic fleet at Brest, creating a force powerful enough to control the English Channel long enough to transport invasion barges across. Boscawen received orders to prevent this junction at all costs. He took command of the Mediterranean fleet with explicit instructions. The French Toulon squadron could not be allowed to reach the Atlantic. In practical terms, this meant blockading Toulon, or, if the French managed to escape, pursuing and destroying them before they could unite with the Brest fleet. Blockade duty was tedious, exhausting work, keeping ships at sea for months, maintaining constant watch on enemy ports, enduring storms and equipment failures far from repair facilities. In August, French Admiral Delaclue decided he'd waited long enough. On the night of the 17th, he led 12 ships of the line out of Toulon under cover of darkness, hoping to slip past British patrols. He nearly succeeded. The French squadron made it through the Straits of Gibraltar before British scouts spotted them. The hunt was on. Boscawen commanded 14 ships of the line, a slight numerical advantage, but not overwhelming. What mattered more was catching the French before they reached the open Atlantic where they could scatter. On the 18th of August, British lookouts spotted French sails off the Portuguese coast near Lagos. Delaclue was making for the Atlantic at maximum speed. Boscawen ordered general chase, every British ship to pursue at maximum speed regardless of formation. The chase lasted hours. British ships were generally faster sailers than French equivalents, partly due to superior copper sheathing on their hulls that prevented marine growth. By afternoon, the fastest British ships were within cannon range of the slowest French vessels. Delaclue faced an impossible decision: turn and fight with his scattered squadron, or continue fleeing and watch his slowest ships get picked off one by one. He chose to fight. What happened next was tactically brilliant and diplomatically outrageous. The running fight pushed into Lagos Bay on the Portuguese coast. Portugal was neutral. Attacking ships in Portuguese territorial waters violated international law. Boscawen didn't hesitate. He ordered his ships to follow the French into the bay and continue the attack. Portuguese shore batteries fired warning shots at both fleets, demanding they cease hostilities. Boscawen ignored them completely. The fighting was savage. Ships engaged at close range, sometimes less than 100 yards separating opponents, hammering each other with broadsides that shattered hulls and toppled masts. British crews fired faster and more accurately, the result of endless drilling that Boscawen insisted upon. The French 80-gun Ocean, Delaclue's flagship, fought desperately but was overwhelmed by multiple British ships. Delaclue himself was mortally wounded. The Ocean eventually grounded on the Portuguese coast and burned. By evening, 5 French ships had been captured or destroyed. 2 had burned after running aground. 3 had been battered into surrender. The remainder scattered. The French Mediterranean fleet ceased to exist as a fighting force. The invasion of Britain was finished before it could begin. The strategic impact was decisive. France abandoned invasion plans entirely. British forces in North America and India could continue operations without fear of being recalled. The Royal Navy's Mediterranean dominance was absolute. Portugal lodged formal protests about violation of their territorial waters. Spain complained. France denounced British barbarity. None of it mattered strategically. Lagos established Boscawen's reputation as one of Britain's foremost fighting admirals. He demonstrated strategic vision, tactical brilliance, and ruthless determination in pursuing victory regardless of diplomatic complications. But Lagos wasn't Boscawen's only contribution. Louisbourg and Lagos together represented a combination that shattered French naval power in two critical theatres. When historians tally Boscawen's strategic impact, they typically focus on individual battles: Lagos, Louisbourg, Cape Finisterre. But the broader picture reveals something more profound. Across a 15-year period, Boscawen's victories systematically dismantled the naval power of three rival empires and established British maritime supremacy that would endure for over a century. This wasn't accidental. It was the cumulative effect of aggressive tactics, strategic vision, and relentless execution across multiple theatres. The French Empire bore the most direct impact. Lagos in 1759 destroyed France's Mediterranean fleet, eliminating their naval presence in that sea for the remainder of the war. Louisbourg in 1758 opened the pathway to conquering French Canada. Quebec fell in 1759, Montreal in 1760, and by 1763, France had ceded virtually all North American possessions to Britain. The Treaty of Paris that ended the 7 Years' War saw France surrender Canada, all territories east of the Mississippi River, and acknowledge British dominance in India. French naval power, which had challenged Britain throughout the early 18th century, was broken. They still possessed ships, certainly, but the strategic capacity to contest British control of vital sea lanes was gone. The Spanish Empire's humbling was more indirect, but no less real. Spain entered the 7 Years' War in 1762 as France's ally through the Family Compact, hoping their combined fleets could challenge British supremacy. It was catastrophic miscalculation. British naval dominance established through victories like Lagos meant Spanish fleets were intimidated into defensive postures, staying in port rather than risking battle. Boscawen's Mediterranean dominance throughout 1758-1759 had prevented any Spanish-French naval cooperation from developing when it might have mattered. Spanish colonies became vulnerable. Havana fell to British amphibious assault in 1762, Manila the same year. Spain's treaty settlement required ceding Florida to Britain and acknowledging British commercial rights throughout their empire. The Dutch represent the most subtle case. The Netherlands never fought Britain directly during the 7 Years' War, maintaining official neutrality. But Dutch maritime commerce and naval power declined precipitously during this period as direct consequence of British naval supremacy. Dutch merchant shipping depended on accessing markets and carrying goods between European powers and their colonies. British blockades and commerce raiding made this increasingly dangerous and unprofitable. Insurance rates for Dutch ships soared. Trade routes shifted to British vessels that could sail under Royal Navy protection. The Dutch Navy, once formidable enough to challenge England in 3 17th-century wars, was completely outclassed. Dutch shipyards that had built warships now focused on merchant vessels. The golden age of Dutch maritime dominance had definitively ended. Boscawen's personal contribution to this strategic transformation was substantial. Lagos alone didn't sink the French Navy, but it eliminated their Mediterranean fleet at a critical moment. Louisbourg didn't single-handedly conquer Canada, but it provided the essential gateway. His aggressive tactics at Cape Finisterre crippled French Atlantic naval power. The pattern was consistent. Boscawen appeared at strategic choke points and delivered victories that had consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. His tactical innovations became Royal Navy doctrine. The aggressive close-range engagement he favored replaced cautious long-range cannonades. His amphibious warfare coordination at Louisbourg established templates for combined operations. His blockade techniques demonstrated how naval forces could strategically contain enemy fleets. His attention to crew welfare created healthier, more effective crews. By 1760, when Boscawen's active sea service ended due to deteriorating health, the strategic situation he'd helped create was clear. Britain controlled Atlantic sea lanes, dominated the Mediterranean, possessed overwhelming naval superiority in North American waters, and had established supremacy in Indian Ocean approaches. French, Spanish, and Dutch naval power existed, but was unable to effectively challenge British maritime hegemony. This dominance enabled British Empire expansion throughout the subsequent century. The three empires Boscawen had helped humble would recover to varying degrees. France would rebuild a formidable navy. Spain would maintain colonial possessions. The Dutch would remain significant maritime traders. But none would again achieve the relative parity with Britain that had existed before the 1750s. And yet, despite this extraordinary strategic legacy, Boscawen would fade from public memory with remarkable speed. The years of relentless campaigning across oceans and climates exacted a brutal toll on Boscawen's health. The fevers he'd contracted during his East Indies deployment in 1748 never fully left him. Tropical diseases of the era, malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, often became chronic conditions that weakened victims for life. Boscawen suffered recurring bouts of fever that left him bedridden for weeks at a time. The stress of command didn't help. Responsibility for thousands of lives, decisions that could mean victory or disaster, the constant mental calculations of wind, weather, enemy movements, and logistics, all of it wore on even the strongest constitutions. Despite his own suffering, Boscawen maintained his unusual concern for his sailors' welfare. He pushed for hospital improvements in naval ports, arguing that treating sick sailors quickly and effectively meant getting them back to duty faster. He continued advocating for dietary reforms, citing evidence that citrus fruits prevented scurvy, even when medical establishment remained skeptical. He supported merit-based promotion over the traditional system, where wealthy officers could purchase ranks regardless of ability. These weren't radical reforms by modern standards, but in the rigid hierarchy of Georgian naval service, they marked Boscawen as unusually progressive. His family life provided refuge from professional pressures. Letters between Edward and Francis reveal a tender domesticity that contrasted sharply with his warrior reputation. He wrote to her about their children's education, household matters, his longing to return to Cornwall. She wrote to him about managing the estate, local affairs, and her worry for his health. 5 children survived to adulthood, which was fortunate in an era when childhood mortality claimed roughly half of all births. Boscawen was a devoted father when duty allowed him to be home, though naval service meant long absences. By 1760, following the Lagos campaign and years of continuous service, Boscawen's health had deteriorated to the point where sea duty was no longer feasible. He was 49 years old, but looked and felt considerably older. The Admiralty appointed him to the Admiralty Board, a shore position that allowed him to contribute strategic planning expertise without the physical demands of commanding at sea. He continued advocating for the reforms he'd championed throughout his career: better conditions for sailors, merit promotion, improved medical care. His final illness came suddenly in January 1761. The exact cause remains unclear in historical records, possibly one of the recurring tropical fevers finally overwhelming his weakened system, possibly pneumonia or another respiratory infection. 18th century medicine couldn't diagnose with precision and could treat even less effectively. Boscawen died on the 10th of January 1761 at his home. He was 49 years old. The nation mourned. Newspapers praised his service. Parliament acknowledged his contributions. Naval officers who'd served under him expressed genuine grief. He'd been respected, and, unusually for senior commanders, actually liked by subordinates who appreciated his concern for their welfare. He was buried at St. Michael Penkerville in Cornwall, the county of his birth. But there was no grand state funeral, no massive monument in Westminster Abbey, no national shrine to his memory. The recognition was sincere but modest, appropriate for a successful admiral, but not approaching the adulation that would later be heaped on Nelson. And here's where the historical amnesia began. Within a generation, Boscawen's name was fading from public consciousness. By the early 19th century, he was barely remembered outside naval circles. By the 20th century, he'd become a footnote in histories focused on more famous commanders. The question is why? Boscawen's achievements matched or exceeded those of admirals who remained famous. He never lost a major engagement. He captured or destroyed dozens of enemy warships. He pioneered tactics and operational concepts that became standard practice. He helped secure an empire. Yet somehow, he slipped from memory whilst others became legends. The answer lies partly in comparison with the one admiral whose fame would eclipse all others who came before. Comparing Boscawen to Horatio Nelson reveals why one became immortal whilst the other faded into obscurity. And the reasons have less to do with actual achievement than with circumstance, timing, and the nature of how historical memory operates. Boscawen fought his major campaigns from 1747 to 1759. Nelson's came 50 years later, from 1794 to 1805. Half a century separated them, but that half-century made all the difference in how their stories would be remembered. Boscawen fought France at the height of its power under Louis XV, when the French navy was a formidable force with experienced crews, well-built ships, and competent admirals. His victories came against worthy opponents who made him work for every success. Nelson fought France after the revolutionary chaos had gutted the officer corps, destroyed institutional knowledge, and left the French navy struggling to rebuild competence. This isn't to diminish Nelson's achievements, he was brilliant by any measure, but context matters when assessing difficulty. The nature of their victories differed fundamentally. Boscawen's successes were strategic and systematic. He won through superior tactics, better logistics, careful planning, and relentless execution. Lagos was decisive, certainly, but it was a pursuit and destruction of a fleeing enemy rather than a dramatic clash of battle lines. Louisbourg was a siege, methodical and effective, but not particularly romantic. Cape Finisterre engagements were victories through aggressive tactics rather than dramatic gestures. Nelson's victories were spectacular theatre. The Nile, Copenhagen, Trafalgar, each involved dramatic tactical innovations, personal bravery bordering on recklessness, and visual spectacle that captured public imagination. Nelson's signal at Trafalgar, "England expects that every man will do his duty," became immortal. Boscawen had no equivalent moment of quotable drama. His old Dreadnought nickname captured his character, but lacked the poetry that creates legends. Then there's the manner of death, which proved decisive in shaping historical memory. Nelson died at Trafalgar in the moment of his greatest triumph, shot by a French marksman whilst directing the battle. It was perfect martyrdom, the hero dying at the pinnacle of victory, his last words concerning duty and England, his death ensuring the battle would be remembered forever. The narrative was irresistible. Artists painted it, poets wrote about it. The entire nation mourned in a way that transformed Nelson from successful admiral into secular saint. Boscawen died in bed of fever, at home, retired from active service. There was nothing romantic or dramatic about it. He simply got sick and died, the way most people do. His death closed his story quietly rather than explosively. No final words became famous, no dramatic death scene for artists to immortalize. Just an old admiral succumbing to tropical diseases, contracted years earlier in service to his country. The media landscape had changed dramatically between their eras. In 1759, newspapers existed, but literacy was limited and distribution sporadic. News of Lagos reached the public, certainly, but the mechanisms for creating celebrity didn't exist as they would 50 years later. By 1805, mass literacy was spreading, newspapers were ubiquitous, and the capacity for creating and sustaining public heroes had evolved enormously. Nelson benefited from this change. His victories were reported extensively, his personal life dissected in print, his image reproduced in countless formats. Boscawen had fought in an era before mass media could create lasting fame. Artistic commemoration followed similar patterns. Nelson received statues, monuments, paintings, and eventually a massive column in Trafalgar Square that remains one of London's most recognizable landmarks. Boscawen received a modest monument in Cornwall and a few portraits. The visual reminder of Nelson's existence remained constantly before public eyes. Boscawen's image faded, because there was nothing to reinforce memory. Historical writing compounded the difference. The Napoleonic Wars generated enormous documentation, memoirs, histories, analyses that kept those events in public consciousness for generations. The 7 Years' War, despite its global scope and transformative consequences, was less extensively chronicled and quickly overshadowed by the revolutionary and Napoleonic conflicts that followed. The simple truth is that Nelson's death created a legend. Boscawen's quiet passing created a memory that gradually faded. Both were brilliant admirals. Both reshaped naval warfare. But only one died in a way that guaranteed immortality. Boscawen's tactical legacy to the Royal Navy extended far beyond his personal victories, shaping naval doctrine for generations and directly enabling the successes of admirals who came after him, including Nelson himself. The innovations he pioneered became so thoroughly integrated into standard practice that their origins were forgotten, even as their effectiveness remained. Aggressive close engagement was perhaps his most fundamental contribution. Before Boscawen's era, naval battles typically involved fleets maintaining formation at long range, exchanging cannonades from hundreds of yards, whilst maneuvering cautiously to preserve expensive ships. Admirals who lost vessels faced career-ending inquiries, which naturally encouraged caution. Boscawen demonstrated repeatedly that closing to decisive range, what sailors called pistol shot, delivered far more destructive results despite accepting greater damage to your own ships. At close range, British advantages in gunnery training and rate of fire became overwhelming. French ships might match British vessels in construction quality, but British crews could fire 3 broadsides whilst the French managed 2, and at close range, every shot told. This doctrine of aggressive engagement became standard Royal Navy practice. When Nelson broke the French line at Trafalgar, he was executing tactics Boscawen had used 50 years earlier. Amphibious warfare coordination was Boscawen's second major innovation. Louisbourg demonstrated systematic naval gunfire support for land operations executed with unprecedented precision. He developed rotating bombardment schedules that kept constant pressure on shore defenses whilst allowing individual ships to withdraw for repairs. He coordinated timing between naval bombardment and infantry assaults, so troops advanced whilst enemy defenders were still suppressed by shellfire. He established procedures for landing troops under fire, using naval gunfire to cover their approach. These techniques became templates used throughout the Peninsular War when British forces conducted amphibious operations along the Spanish coast. Every beach landing that Royal Marines and Army troops would execute for the next century traced lineage back to Louisbourg. Pursuit to destruction, rather than accepting surrender, marked another shift in naval thinking. Traditional doctrine valued capturing enemy ships intact as prizes that could be sold or added to your own fleet. Boscawen certainly captured prizes when practical, but at Lagos he demonstrated willingness to destroy French ships rather than let them escape. He pursued fleeing enemies into neutral waters, violated Portuguese sovereignty, and burned ships that couldn't be easily captured. The strategic objective was eliminating enemy naval power, not maximizing prize money. This ruthless approach to naval warfare prioritized strategic goals over tactical gains. Blockade warfare reached new levels of effectiveness under Boscawen's commands. Maintaining close blockade of enemy ports for months required keeping ships at sea through storms, equipment failures, and crew exhaustion. Most admirals preferred distant blockade, staying well offshore and intercepting enemies if they ventured out. Boscawen pioneered close blockade, positioning squadrons near enough to enemy harbours that escape attempts could be immediately detected and pursued. His Toulon blockade in 1759 prevented French fleet movements until Delaclu's desperate breakout attempt, which Boscawen then crushed at Lagos. This blockade doctrine would reach its peak during the Napoleonic Wars, when British squadrons maintained watch over French ports for years. Sailor welfare improvements had direct tactical consequences. Scurvy-ravaged crews couldn't fight effectively. Ships losing half their complements to disease couldn't maintain blockades or pursue enemies. Boscawen's advocacy for dietary improvements, better hospital facilities, and merit-based promotion created healthier, more professional crews. The Royal Navy's systematic adoption of citrus rations after 1795 traced back to arguments officers like Boscawen had made decades earlier based on empirical observation. These innovations trained and influenced the next generation of British admirals. Officers who served under Boscawen carried his methods forward. Admiral Edward Hawke, who won the decisive Battle of Quiberon Bay in 1759, had learned aggressive tactics from Boscawen's example. Admiral George Rodney, who broke French naval power in the Caribbean during the American Revolution, studied Boscawen's campaigns. The chain of influence extended to Nelson, who never served under Boscawen, but absorbed tactical doctrine that Boscawen had helped create. Modern naval warfare still reflects principles Boscawen established: aggressive engagement at decisive range, coordinated amphibious operations, strategic blockade, professional crew training. The specifics changed. Steam replaced sail, steel replaced wood, missiles replaced cannon, but fundamental concepts remained. Edward Boscawen's career spanned barely 15 years of active fleet command, yet in that time he fundamentally altered the balance of global maritime power. The statistics alone tell a remarkable story. 3 major campaigns commanded, dozens of naval engagements fought, over 20 enemy warships captured or destroyed, 0 defeats as fleet commander. He secured British control of North American waters, shattered French Mediterranean naval power, prevented invasion of Britain, and established the naval supremacy that would underpin British imperial expansion for the next century. But raw numbers don't capture his full significance. Boscawen appeared at critical strategic junctures and delivered victories precisely when they mattered most. Cape Finisterre, in 1747, crippled French Atlantic naval capability at the end of the War of Austrian Succession. The Newfoundland action in 1755 delayed French reinforcement of Canada during the crucial opening phase of the 7 Years' War. Louisbourg in 1758 opened the gateway to conquering French North America. Lagos in 1759 destroyed the invasion threat to Britain and ensured French Mediterranean fleet would never again challenge British dominance. Each victory had consequences far beyond the immediate tactical situation. His tactical innovations became foundational Royal Navy doctrine. Aggressive close engagement, amphibious warfare coordination, relentless pursuit, strategic blockade, professional crew development. These weren't just Boscawen's personal preferences. They became institutional practices that successive generations of British admirals would employ to dominate the world's oceans. Nelson's victories at the Nile and Trafalgar were built on tactical foundations Boscawen helped establish. Yet he's forgotten, whilst Nelson remains immortal. The reasons are clear enough. Nelson died dramatically at the moment of supreme triumph. Boscawen died quietly at home. Nelson fought during an era of mass media that could create and sustain celebrity. Boscawen fought before such mechanisms existed. Nelson had Trafalgar, a single perfect battle that could be commemorated forever. Boscawen had a series of strategic successes that individually seemed less dramatic. Nelson received monuments throughout Britain. Boscawen got a modest memorial in Cornwall. The historical injustice is obvious. Without Boscawen's victories in the 1750s, there would have been no British Empire for Nelson to defend in the 1800s. French Canada would have remained French, potentially changing the entire trajectory of North American history. French naval power would have remained strong enough to contest British maritime supremacy. The Industrial Revolution that Britain would lead might have taken different form if British merchant shipping hadn't dominated global trade routes that Boscawen's victories helped secure. Modern historians are beginning to correct this oversight. Naval historians recognize Boscawen as among the greatest fighting admirals Britain produced. Academic studies examine his campaigns for insights into 18th-century naval warfare. His tactical innovations receive credit they deserve. But popular consciousness remains ignorant. Ask people to name great British admirals, and they'll say Nelson, perhaps Drake. Boscawen's name draws blank stares. he deserves better. The man who earned the nickname Old Dreadnought through fearless service across 3 oceans deserves recognition alongside the naval heroes whose fame endured. The admiral who cared enough about his sailors to advocate for their welfare deserves remembrance for his humanity as much as his tactical brilliance. The commander who won every major engagement he fought deserves a place in the pantheon of military greats. 3 empires crushed, 1 empire built. Without Boscawen, French power in North America continues. Spanish naval strength remains credible. Dutch maritime commerce persists. Without Boscawen's victories, British naval supremacy doesn't become the overwhelming force that shaped the next century. Without Boscawen's tactical innovations, the Royal Navy doesn't develop the doctrines that would make it the world's dominant naval force. He didn't just win battles, he won the world for Britain. Then history forgot him. Perhaps it's time history remembered. If you found this story compelling, let me know in the comments which underrated military commanders deserve more recognition. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because there are dozens more forgotten stories exactly like this one waiting to be told.